The Collins family thought Hill House would be a fresh start. After all, it was a grand estate nestled far away from the noise and chaos of the city. The kind of place where a family could grow, bond, and escape from the pressures of modern life. But from the very first night, things were off. It wasn't the creaking floors or the groaning pipes that put them on edge, it was the feeling. The oppressive weight that hung in the air, almost as if the house itself was watching, waiting. The first few days passed with an unsettling quiet. Doors that had been left wide open were suddenly closed, but no one had touched them. The family dog refused to enter certain rooms, growling at empty spaces. Ethan, the oldest of the Collins children, joked that the house was probably haunted, but no one laughed. His younger sister, Lily, was quieter than usual, her eyes darting around the dimly lit corners as if she saw something the rest of them didn't. One evening, while unpacking boxes in the attic, Mrs. Collins heard a soft whisper. It was faint, almost too quiet to make out, but it sent a chill down her spine. She brushed it off as the wind, though there was no breeze in the house that night. That same night, Lily woke up crying, claiming she had seen someone standing at the foot of her bed. But when Mr. Collins checked, there was no one there, just the lingering scent of something rotten. The family tried to ignore the little things. After all, old houses were bound to have quirks, right? But the quirks quickly turned into something much more sinister. Footsteps echoed in the halls late at night when everyone was supposed to be asleep. Objects disappeared only to reappear in strange, impossible places. And then there were the shadows, always moving, always shifting, never quite where they should be. Still, the Collins family held on to the hope that it was just the stress of moving. They told themselves it was nothing. But deep down, each one of them knew that something was terribly wrong with Hill House. The strange happenings in Hill House grew more frequent, each incident chipping away at the family's sense of security. It started with Lily, who was spending more and more time in her room, speaking softly to someone no one else could see. At first, her parents thought it was an imaginary friend, a harmless phase that young children often went through. But soon, it became clear that Lily wasn't inventing stories. She insisted that a little girl named Emily lived in her room, and she often spoke of her in chilling detail, how Emily wore a white dress with a stain on the chest and how her eyes never looked right. Mr. Collins, ever the skeptic, dismissed it as childhood imagination. But when Ethan started experiencing something more physical, his disbelief began to waver. Ethan had always been a deep sleeper, but now, he would wake up in the dead of night, unable to move. His body frozen, his mind fully awake. He could feel a presence, something heavy, pressing down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. In the corner of his room, a figure stood, watching him in silence. It never approached, but its mere presence filled Ethan with an indescribable dread. On the third night, Ethan woke with a scream, pulling his sheets off the bed as he scrambled to the door. When his parents rushed in, they found him trembling, his face pale. He insisted that someone had been in his room, standing right by his bed, staring down at him. The fear in his eyes was enough to make them question their own skepticism. As the days wore on, the tension in the house thickened. Mrs. Collins began hearing the whispers again, this time closer. She would be folding laundry or preparing dinner, and a voice, soft but persistent, would murmur her name. It was never clear, always just on the edge of hearing, but it was enough to make her freeze in place. Her hands would tremble, her heart racing, but when she turned to look, there was never anyone there. One evening, as Mr. Collins was working late in his home office, he felt a chill run down his spine. The temperature in the room dropped noticeably, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He turned to see the door slowly creak open. The hallway beyond was pitch black, but there was a figure, a tall, gaunt figure, just barely visible at the edge of the light. For a moment, he thought it was his son, but as his eyes adjusted, he realized the figure was far too thin, too distorted to be anyone in his family. It lingered for a moment, then dissolved into the shadows. Desperate for answers, the Collins family reached out to a local historian who specialized in haunted properties. What they learned shook them to their core. Hill House, it seemed, had a history drenched in tragedy. The previous owners, a family much like the Collins, had been found dead under mysterious circumstances. No one had ever been able to explain their deaths, and the house had remained vacant for years until the Collins purchased it. The historian warned them that Hill House was not a normal home. It had a dark past, one that was not easily left behind. The spirits of those who had suffered within its walls remained, trapped in an endless cycle of torment. They fed off the energy of the living, growing stronger with every fear, every doubt, every moment of terror. That night, the atmosphere in Hill House shifted dramatically. The temperature plummeted, and a deep sense of foreboding settled over the family. It wasn't just fear anymore, it was dread. And as the clock struck midnight, the real terror began. As the paranormal activity in Hill House intensified, the Collins family found themselves trapped in a waking nightmare. It was clear now that the house was not just haunted by random spirits, but by something far more sinister, something that was targeting them specifically. Determined to uncover the truth, Mrs. Collins dove deeper into the house's dark history, combing through old documents, newspaper clippings, and anything that could explain the horror they were living through. In a forgotten corner of the attic, hidden beneath dust-covered boxes and broken furniture, she found an old chest. Inside were remnants of the previous owner's lives, letters, photographs, and a worn journal. The journal belonged to a woman named Margaret Fairchild, who had lived in the house over a century ago. Margaret's entries were disturbing, filled with frantic scribbles about voices in the walls, shadowy figures that roamed the halls at night, and strange occurrences that mirrored what the Collins family was now experiencing. One entry stood out, asterisk, "They watch us. Even when we think we're alone, they are there. We cannot escape them. They won't let us leave. The house, it feeds on us." Asterisk. The more Mrs. Collins read, the more she realized that their situation was not unique. Hill House had a long history of driving its inhabitants mad, eventually claiming their lives in brutal and mysterious ways. The spirits trapped in the house were the souls of those who had died there, victims of the house's insatiable hunger for suffering. Each family that had moved in had met a tragic end, and now the Collins family was next. Meanwhile, Ethan and Lily's behavior grew more erratic. Ethan became withdrawn, spending long hours locked in his room, refusing to talk about what he had seen. But Mrs. Collins knew something was terribly wrong. She could see the fear in his eyes, the way he flinched at every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind. Lily, on the other hand, seemed to embrace the presence of the supernatural, growing disturbingly close to her imaginary friend, Emily. She would spend hours talking to her, even setting a place for her at the dinner table, much to the horror of her parents. One night, as Mr. Collins sat in the living room, he noticed something odd about one of the family photos hanging on the wall. It was a picture of them taken on their first day at Hill House. But now, something was different. In the background, just behind them, there was a figure, a pale, thin figure with hollow eyes, barely visible in the shadows. He hadn't noticed it before, but now, it was unmistakable. The figure had been there all along, watching them from the moment they arrived. Terrified, Mr. Collins tried to take the photo down, but it wouldn't budge. No matter how hard he pulled, it was as if the picture was glued to the wall. Frustrated and scared, he smashed the frame, but when he did, a dark, foul-smelling liquid seeped out from behind the glass, soaking the photo. The figure in the background seemed to shift, its hollow eyes now locked onto him, as if it was aware of what he had done. Panicked, Mr. Collins called out to his wife, but the moment she entered the room, the temperature dropped. They could see their breath fogging in the air as the room grew colder and colder. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the hall, coming closer with each passing second. But when they turned to look, there was nothing there, just the lingering sense that they were being watched. Desperate for help, the family contacted a paranormal investigator, a woman named Dr. Evelyn Black, who had a reputation for dealing with extreme hauntings. When she arrived, her face paled as she stepped into the house. She could feel the darkness immediately, the weight of the spirits that clung to the walls, the floors, the very air they breathed. Dr. Black conducted a séance to communicate with the spirits trapped in the house, hoping to understand what they wanted. But what she discovered was far worse than anyone could have imagined. The spirits weren't just trapped, they were bound to the house by something older, darker, and more powerful. Hill House wasn't just haunted, it was cursed. During the séance, the temperature in the room plummeted, and a heavy silence fell over them. Then, without warning, the table shook violently, and the candles flickered out. In the darkness, they could hear whispering, thousands of voices, all speaking at once, their words overlapping in a terrifying chorus. Asterisk, you will not leave. You will never leave. Asterisk. Dr. Black was thrown from her chair, gasping for breath as an unseen force gripped her by the throat. The family watched in horror as she struggled, her body lifted into the air by an invisible hand. Just as suddenly, she was dropped to the floor, unconscious but alive. When she awoke, her voice was shaky, barely audible as she whispered, asterisk, it's not the spirits. It's the house. The house wants you. Asterisk. After the terrifying séance, the Collins family found themselves spiraling deeper into the nightmare that was Hill House. Dr. Black's warning echoed in their minds, asterisk, the house wants you. Asterisk, it wasn't just the spirits of the dead tormenting them, it was the house itself, an ancient entity that had ensnared them in its web of fear and madness. Every corner of the mansion seemed alive, pulsating with a malevolent energy that grew stronger with each passing day. Ethan, who had once been the most rational and level-headed of the family, was now barely recognizable. He had retreated entirely into himself, refusing to leave his room, barely eating or sleeping. The paralyzing fear that had started with his nighttime terrors now consumed him day and night. He claimed to see the figure constantly, standing just outside his door, waiting for him to step outside. And when he did venture into the hallways, it was always with the sensation that someone, or something, was watching, just out of sight. Meanwhile, Lily had grown eerily calm. Her conversations with Emily had become more frequent, and her once playful chatter had turned dark, as if Emily was feeding her unsettling thoughts. One evening, as her mother tucked her into bed, Lily smiled up at her and whispered, asterisk, Emily says you're next. Asterisk, Mrs. Collins recoiled in shock, her heart racing as she tried to laugh it off, but the look in her daughter's eyes was far too knowing for a child of her age. The pressure of the haunting was taking its toll on Mrs. Collins as well. She had begun to see things, brief flashes of movement in the corner of her eye, faces in the mirrors that vanished when she looked directly at them. The whispers followed her everywhere now, louder and more insistent, calling her name, urging her to do things she would never have considered before. And then there were the dreams, vivid, horrifying dreams in which she was trapped in the house, its walls closing in on her, the shadows reaching out to drag her into the darkness. Mr. Collins, who had tried to hold everything together, was now breaking under the weight of it all. His attempts to protect his family had failed, and the helplessness gnawed at him. He spent his nights pacing the halls, his nerves frayed, jumping at every creak and groan the house made. It wasn't long before he started seeing the figure too, the tall, gaunt specter with hollow eyes, always lurking just out of reach, watching him with a malevolent hunger. The family's interactions became strained. Every conversation ended in arguments, accusations, and blame. The once close-knit Collins family was fracturing under the relentless assault of Hill House. No one trusted each other anymore, each convinced that the house had gotten to the others, twisting their minds and turning them into something unrecognizable. One night, the tension reached a boiling point. Ethan, delirious with fear, barricaded himself in his room, convinced that his family had been possessed by the spirits of the house. He screamed for hours, his voice hoarse, begging them to leave him alone. When Mr. Collins finally broke down the door, he found his son cowering in the corner, his eyes wide with terror. Ethan pointed to the ceiling, where dark, shadowy figures twisted and writhed, their ghostly forms just barely visible in the dim light. The sight was too much for Mr. Collins. He grabbed his wife and daughter, and together they fled the house, leaving Ethan behind in his locked room, too terrified to move him. But the moment they stepped outside, it became clear that the house wasn't done with them yet. The front door slammed shut behind them, and a low, ominous growl rumbled through the air. The trees around the property swayed violently, though there was no wind. The ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble, as if the earth itself was rejecting their presence. Desperate to escape, Mr. Collins tried to drive away, but the car wouldn't start. Every attempt to flee was met with an invisible barrier, as if the house had extended its reach beyond its walls, trapping them within its grasp. They were prisoners, and there was no escape. In their desperation, the family turned to Dr. Black once more. Though she was still recovering from the violent seance, she agreed to return to Hill House for one final attempt to break the curse. Armed with ancient rituals and protective talismans, she believed she could sever the connection between the house and the spirits that haunted it. But as soon as she crossed the threshold, the air grew thick with malevolence. Dr. Black moved through the house, chanting in a language none of the Collins family could understand. But it was clear that whatever she was doing was angering the house. The walls began to shake, pictures fell from the walls, and the floorboards creaked and groaned as if the very foundation of the house was being torn apart. The temperature dropped so rapidly that their breath turned to mist, and the lights flickered violently before plunging the house into total darkness. In the pitch-black silence, they heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and getting closer. They could feel the presence of something ancient, something far older than the spirits that had tormented them. It was the house itself, alive and aware of their every move, and it was furious. Just as Dr. Black completed the final incantation, the ground beneath them shook violently. The walls began to crack, and the house groaned as if in agony. For a brief moment, they thought it had worked. The oppressive energy lifted, and the air felt lighter. But then, from deep within the bowels of the house, came a sound that chilled them to the bone, a low, guttural laugh that echoed through the walls, growing louder and more menacing with each passing second. The house wasn't just haunted. It was alive. The moment the guttural laugh filled the house, the Collins family knew they were no longer fighting mere spirits, they were up against something far worse. The very structure of Hill House had become a living entity, and it had no intention of letting them leave. As the laughter echoed through the walls, the temperature plummeted further, and the air grew so thick with dread that it was almost suffocating. Dr. Black stood frozen, her protective talismans dangling uselessly from her hands. Whatever power she thought she had over the house was gone. The ancient entity that inhabited Hill House was far beyond her control, and now it had awakened fully, furious at their attempts to banish it. She whispered frantically to the family, urging them to run, to flee the house while they still had a chance. But the house had other plans. As the Collins family rushed toward the front door, the walls began to shift and warp, twisting in on themselves like a living maze. The hallway stretched impossibly long, doors vanished before their eyes, and the familiar layout of the house transformed into a nightmarish labyrinth. Every time they turned a corner, they found themselves back where they started, as if the house was toying with them, letting them think they were close to escape only to drag them back into its clutches. Panic set in. Lily clung to her mother, her small body shaking with fear as she whispered, Emily says we're never leaving. Ethan, still half mad from the terror he had endured, stumbled through the halls, muttering incoherently about the shadowy figures that lurked just out of sight. Mr. Collins, usually the pillar of strength, was frantic, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he banged on walls, screaming for help that would never come. And then the attacks began. It started with the whispers, soft at first, like distant voices carried on the wind. But soon, they grew louder, more insistent, filling the air with a cacophony of overlapping voices, all screaming, pleading, and laughing. Shadows stretched across the walls, reaching out with long, skeletal fingers, brushing against the family as they ran. The temperature dropped so low that their skin began to sting, and a fine layer of frost formed on the windows and floors. As they reached the staircase, the ground beneath them gave way. The wood splintered and cracked, sending Mr. Collins tumbling into the darkness below. His scream was cut off by a sickening thud as he hit the floor beneath, his body crumpled and still. Mrs. Collins let out a choked sob, her mind barely able to process the horror that had unfolded in front of her. But there was no time to grieve. The house was closing in on them, and if they didn't move, they would all suffer the same fate. Dr. Black, pale and trembling, led the remaining family members through the crumbling house, her voice shaking as she chanted desperate incantations to hold the malevolent force at bay. But the house was too strong, too ancient, and its hunger for their fear was insatiable. Every step they took seemed to anger it more, and the walls began to close in, suffocating them with their oppressive weight. They reached the front door, but it wouldn't open. No matter how hard they pulled, no matter how many times they slammed their fists against the wood, it remained sealed shut. The house had trapped them. There was no way out. Just when all hope seemed lost, Ethan, who had been silent for most of their escape, stood up, his eyes hollow and vacant. He walked toward the door, ignoring the screams of his mother and sister, and placed his hand on the doorknob. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deafening crack, the door burst open, flooding the room with cold, moonlit air. The house roared in fury, the very foundation shaking as if it was trying to pull them back in. But Ethan, still in his trance-like state, ushered his mother and sister outside, his face expressionless. As they stepped onto the front lawn, the oppressive weight lifted, and the sounds of the house, its laughter, its whispers, faded into the background. But something was wrong. Ethan didn't follow them. He stood just inside the doorway, his eyes fixed on the house, his body rigid. Mrs. Collins screamed for him to come with them, but he didn't move. He simply turned to look at her, his face pale and gaunt, and whispered, "Asterisk, it's not done with me yet." Asterisk. Before they could stop him, Ethan stepped back into the house. The door slammed shut behind him with a final, echoing thud. Mrs. Collins and Lily stood outside, shaking with cold and grief, as the once Grand Hill house loomed in the darkness behind them. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the distant sound of laughter, a mocking, cruel laugh that echoed through the night. They had escaped, but the house had claimed another victim. Hill House stood silent, its windows dark and empty. But it was far from abandoned. The spirits of those who had died there remained, trapped within its walls, waiting for the next family to fall into its grasp. And somewhere inside, Ethan was still there, a prisoner of the house, lost to its eternal hunger.